All righty, I think we're going to get started. As usual, I think we'll have some people trickling in over the next few minutes. Welcome back to our Wildfire seminar series for winter quarter at Stanford. This is our third talk of the quarter. Our usual housekeeping, as you know, we are still on Zoom, and out of abundance of caution and just trying to be on hold with how the university is viewing seminars, especially when we invite external guests, both as speakers and the audience, I've pushed back our tentative hybrid date to Wednesday, February 9th. So this will always be available by Zoom, but we do hope to go live at some point, and hoping and praying maybe by February 9th, Omicron surge will have fallen to a nicer level for all of us. But thank you for your patience. Thank you for joining us on Zoom. As I can see the numbers trickle up, I think we're gonna have a full house today on Zoom. And I'll proceed. We are pleased today, and I just feel privileged that we have Andy Abranches here to take his time out of his very busy schedule and responsibilities at PG&E to share some of his perspectives of how PG&E is looking at this huge problem of wildfires. Andy is the Senior Director of Wildfire Risk at PG&E. His responsibilities cover a bunch of things, including wildfire risk management, wildfire mitigation plans, as well as meteorology and fire science. Andy has been with PG&E for, it looks like 14 years, since 2008. He has worked in a bunch of places, including electric operations, gas operations, finance, HR, and risk management. He holds a bachelor's degree from mechanical engineering from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And prior to coming to PG&E, he worked with Northrop Grumman and GE Healthcare in a variety of technical management roles. I've only known Andy a short time, but I've had some nice conversations with him, and I think you will be impressed with the depth of his knowledge and appreciation of the many problems facing our society, as well as PG&E as being a power provider and worrying about the risks associated with power distribution. He's going to talk about a couple things today, and I hope he'll leave enough time for questions, because I'm sure many of you have questions for him. He's going to talk about some of the things PG&E is doing to address the issues of wildfire risk faced most notably here in California. And I believe he's also going to share a couple challenges for the students in the audience and those who may be hearing this recording later on for the Big Earth Hackathon. He's going to present a couple challenges that he thinks will be relevant both to PG&E as well as fellow citizens of California and the world. So with that aside, I'd like to hand over the screen sharing to his assistant Paige, and thank you for being with us today, Andy. We look forward to your talk and having a nice dialogue.
Hi, thank you, Derek. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I hope I'll be able to live up to everything that you've stated there. So really appreciate the opportunity to share a perspective. As many of you know, PG&E is in the heat of this issue with wildfires and wildland fires. And it's primarily because, electrical equipment, the overhead conductor lines that feed our towns and communities all across California run through some very treacherous territory. And since it's open wire, issues can arise where either the equipment starts the fire or vegetation lands into the equipment, sparking a fire. And once that ignition starts, it's all about what's the consequence around that and what's the conditions around that. So what I'm going to go into, and I'll do this as quickly as possible. I'm really trying not to bleed down slides, but really get there so that we can have a dialogue and I can take as many questions as may be on your minds. And if there are no questions, there's plenty to talk about, so I can go down one path or the other. So let's go to the next slide. So I want to just highlight, from PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric provides power to Northern California. Stanford is right in our service territory. Stanford, I think, holds its own microgrid though. So, but the goal for us at PG&E really is reduce wildfire potential. And what that means is reduce the frequency of any type of ignitions that originate from our assets and our facilities. Whatever we can do to reduce the consequences of any ignitions when they do occur, and then really try to focus the work. We call that work mitigations. This is, whether you're replacing, you're hardening, focus the mitigations on the highest risk locations. So risk modeling plays a pretty big role. The second aspect of that is we have some proven techniques, public safety power shutoff and enhanced power line safety settings. Both of those come at the consequence of reliability. Public safety power shutoff is very clear. You turn the power off to the lines when the wind speeds are at a certain threshold, and as a result, communities are then go dark from electricity, which is really not optimal. So reduce that impact so that you use it only where it's absolutely needed. And then the last one is situational awareness. And for the most part, situational awareness, you can think about it is there's cameras, there's weather stations that provide information of what's happening out in the environment so that we can react. But another larger part of situational awareness is the coordination that happens between various agencies, CAL FIRE being the biggest of those agencies, as well as the California Office of Emergency Services, where we coordinate with them because of situations that arise. Even if the fire is not caused by PG&E, when a fire occurs, it burns out PG&E assets. And so then what you've got to do is you've got to rebuild as that fire has passed to service and provide power to the communities. You also have the issue with before you rebuild, you got to get stuff cleared. You have access to the fire footprints. All of that really, if you look at it from that perspective, right? PG&E has taken a goal to, really in our service territory, we want a catastrophic wildfire shall stop, which means we're going to do everything possible to prevent the impact of catastrophic wildfires to our customers and communities. And we have 6 programs, highlighted below. I'll cover 2 of them in a little bit more depth, but I'll just do a run by on all 6. One is something we call enhanced power line safety settings. I'll jump into that in subsequent slides. Then public safety power shutoffs. Many of you may have heard of those or not. They happen when wind events get to a particular threshold. Then you look at the entire system and ignition components. Are there components that we know have in the course of operation, they throw off sparks? So replacing those ignition components with stuff that does not, new designs basically. Then you've got the system hardening. The most prominent of that is the undergrounding. PG&E has recently made a commitment to underground 10,000 miles in these high fire threat areas. And then vegetation management, which, if you look at it at a high level, there's about 8 to 10 million trees that could come in contact with our power lines. And so the vegetation management, there's a compliance issue where you've got to provide a radial clearance around the lines. And then we've gone beyond compliance with things that we're doing. And then the last one is just asset inspections and repairs. We, in high fire threat districts, we basically inspect the assets, take a look at it, see what the situation is every year. In what's called Tier 3, which is defined by the California Public Utilities, we inspect it every year. And then in Tier 2, we inspect it once every 3 years for the most part. And then you repair the ones that are most significantly damaged. And the damage comes due to storms, due to wind, a whole host of issues. So all 6 of those programs really are intended to address the top 3. Reduce wildfire potential, reduce any impact of PSPS and EPSS, and improve situational awareness. So let me jump into the next slide. And I'll talk about something that is very significant and that has made a huge difference from our perspective. And we did a pretty robust pilot of this last year. And this is what we call enhanced power line safety settings. As many of you may know, in 2021, California experienced a pretty horrendous drought. And at the start of the year, there were indications that it was going to be a dry year, but the degree of drought and the speed at which it continued, and that was driven really by the temperatures faced all across the state, as well as the winds that kind of serve in those hot temperatures. The winds serve an additional feature for drying out the vegetation. This is both the dead fuel as well as the live vegetation that exists. It dries it out. And if with no rain, it gets progressively worse. As that drought was continuing to build, as the months were coming in, what PG&E did, and this is the wildfire team as a whole, looked at everything that we could potentially do. And so this was driving aerial patrols. This is sending literally helicopters over the lines, over fire scars, to identify if there are any trees that are now exhibiting signs of decay or exhibiting signs of weakness, dryness, and then basically taking out those trees. But one thing that we chanced upon was specifically adjusting the settings on existing equipment that exists on the line. There are tools called, there's equipment called reclosers. In some cases, there are fuses that you can adjust, that you operate with the SCADA system, the supervisory access and control system. So from a control center, you can turn a section on or off, or you can adjust it. However, adjusting those settings requires you to literally go out to each piece of equipment and upload new settings, and those settings have to be designed. But rather than getting into the settings, what's the value proposition here? The value proposition of enhanced power line safety settings is really to make the devices most sensitive should something come into contact with the line and trigger a fault. So in the normal operating mode, those sensors and those reclosers are designed to accept a certain degree of something hitting the line, because if it hits the line, you would expect vegetation, you'd expect leaves, you'd expect things like that to hit the line. But what happens is they hit the line, they could get burnt and they'll fall to the ground. And in a normal condition, it's not a risk because you expect some of that to happen. Even animals, right? Animals will run along the line, and as a result, can get electrocuted, and then you'll find they're at the bottom on the grass. But when you got the dry vegetation below, that becomes extremely dangerous. Adjusting these settings specifically takes out what it does is it causes the power to that section to turn off. And so the energy density flowing to that location is significantly reduced enough so that the spark that does get caused, there is a spark, it's significantly less. So that's really what enhanced power line safety settings are. And I say that because as we go into 2022, we had done it on a pilot in 2021 on about 11,000 miles, which is about 170 circuits. And we're going to be doing it on 988 circuits, which cover pretty much 25,000 miles of high fire threat districts, as well as high fire risk areas. And even beyond that, there'll be a section around a buffer zone. So if I go to the next slide. And this slide really captures kind of why we're doing it. We're doing it because what you saw in high fire threat districts when we implemented EPSS at the end of July in 2021 was all across from July all the way up to November when we put those settings back to the normal settings because of the rain. You saw basically a 46% decrease on the same time period on the same circuits across all high fire threat districts, going back, looking at a 3-year average. On the specific circuits that you put EPSS settings on, we saw an 80% decrease in ignitions around that same time period. So from an impact perspective, a huge reduction in ignitions, which is a big part of our goal to prevent the wildfire from starting in the first place. If I go to the next slide. So at a high level, right, really what we're doing for 2022 is expanding it to all, HFRA, HFTD. HFTD stands for High Fire Threat District. HFRA stands for High Fire Risk Area, right? But then what you do have to do with that is if you're going to expand that, you've also got to put programs to help recover the reliability that you lose because it's going to trigger much more frequently. which is the third bullet, minimize customer reliability impacts. So we are pivoting some of our veg programs towards that reliability recovery. Also, there'll be proactive outreach to customers, and then coordination of the program efforts across a whole host of internal programs, but also with external partners on that. And then the value proposition really with what we're calling EPSS is that it only triggers when something hits the line. So it's a fault. It's not something that you do proactively up front. You put the circuits in that mode, and then should something create a dangerous condition, the circuit turns off. So it's very different from PSPS. Public safety power shutoff, you do basically when the wind conditions and the relative humidity, for the most part, get to certain thresholds, you proactively turn the power off. Then you actually have to go examine the lines to see that there's nothing on the line, and then you turn the power on. But it impacts a much larger footprint of customers because of that. So we'll pause on this. I'll jump into the next section about veg, and then I can go into the ideas that I have on the class or others may be interested in for something that could help everybody, and then take questions. So let's go to the next slide. So I just want to give an overview of what we call enhanced vegetation management. So to put this into context, right, across our service territory, there's underground miles and overhead miles on the distribution system. So I'll talk about the distribution system. I'll keep the transmission system out of question here. We do veg on transmission as well. But for the most part, what I'm talking about here is distribution. And for those, electrical engineers on the line, distribution is 12 kV, 23 kV volts. When you get up to transmission, it's 60 kV, 70 kV, 115 and above, going all the way up to 500 kV. On the distribution system, from a compliance perspective, right, the regulations are that you do basically a 4-foot clearance around the line. And that's the regulation. So that's the compliance requirement that you do anyway. We would do that on the 80,000 miles every year that are over, that are basically whether it sits in high fire or non-high fire, that's the standard you do. However, in high fire threat districts, which is about 25,000 miles, you basically go beyond that standard. And what we do on that standard is we do a 12-foot clearance. And that 12-foot was based on studies to determine where did we see vegetation falling into lines or coming into contact. As well as you do what's called a conductor to sky, which means you look above the line and you look for overhang, and you'll take out overhang. Now that's pretty significant when you think of some of the locations where we have our lines running through, because if they're running through, massive ponderosa pine, sequoias, you've got to decide, okay, how far higher are you going to go on that? Because those trees, in some cases, are pretty massive. But the intent of this program really is to prevent vegetation from coming into contact with the lines, because vegetation is one of the largest reasons why you get a wildfire with electrical equipment, because the vegetation falls into the line. There's a ton of vegetation around the lines anyway. Now there's a balance, and the balance is really when you talk about the tree aspect of it, which is there's trees that are constantly in the state of growth, as well as in the state of dying out. It's a natural habitat. It's a forest. You should expect that die out to happen. But what you're trying to prevent is, how do you identify which trees need to be removed? And that's sort of abate the tree is the phrase that's used, but you've got to identify which tree needs to be removed. And you've got to do that continuously. That process, right, is extremely challenging, because sometimes you cannot tell if the tree has issues on the inside simply by doing a visual inspection on the outside. And so in those cases, unfortunately, you miss that aspect. And the reason I shared with you EPSS is because our approach is changing. And our approach is changing. Prior to 2021, we did not envision even using a program like EPSS. what we were doing through EVM was trying to find trees that were strike potential, that had become hazardous, and trying to abate them before they fell down. But you can only do that volume, right, at a pace of about 1,800 miles. Now we have 25,000 miles. So then you are using your risk models to triangulate as to where you'd focus the most. With EPSS, we basically can put that over the entire system. So 100% gets covered versus that 1,800 comes out to about 8% a year. So you get coverage for about 100% in one before this 2020-25 season. So, and then you pivot your EVM program to supporting you on recovering the reliability specifically. But you'll move away from searching for the strike potential tree to really focus on the radial clearance and the overhang. So with that, I'm going to pause. Those are the two programs I talked on briefly here. I'm trying to monitor time as well. So let me go into the next section. And this is leading up to two areas where I think a focused team could potentially help us a great deal, and help not just California, but help anyone who's facing this type of a problem, because cities also face a problem with vegetation. But let me just at a high level cover this. When you're examining the trees, the current tree assessment process, what it is you've got to basically look at the tree. So you've got to go visit that location, look at the tree. You're looking for defects on the tree. This is codominant species. This is a tree scar. There's a whole host of things that could come out. And then based on that, you've got to decide whether you abate the tree. When you're doing that, you've got to keep a record of what exactly was it, which is kind of the process to say, why did we abate it? And the reason is that because you've got to be careful that people don't go out of control and just cut trees because they think they're dangerous. You've got to cut them for the right reason, and we've got to put our controls in place. So to support these efforts, really, what could be very helpful is a much more advanced tree assessment tool that basically captures the knowledge, that utilizes the inbuilt knowledge about trees that a professional arborist would bring to the table, right? There's generally a known set of defects that they're looking for. And as you get video history or you get photographs of those defects, you can get a database of knowledge which machine learning tools could use to help identify. And then hopefully on some sort of an app, we do a tree assessment process where you basically take a imagery around the tree. Based on that, you make a determination of what's the condition, and then you develop, a scoring criteria and deciding. You could also use that to scan, not that device, but you could scan from remote sensing to identify zones where potential hazard trees could exist. So then you have ground-based tree assessment that takes place and follows up with it. So that's really the tree assessment process. Let me go to the next slide. So one really good idea would be some sort of mobile digital app, right, to assess the tree, build out the criteria, and capture that criteria for future refinement of models, but also then to make a decision that this is why at this GPS location, this tree needs to be removed. And then crews can come in behind that and remove that. So just a mobile digital app that can over time really learns. Because think about it, we're doing this on 80,000 miles every year. You touch something like 200, 300,000 trees. And it's all with relative judgment. If we can digitize this and use that, it's a great application. The next slide. So I'm pivoting away from this into something else that would be of tremendous use from all the learnings that have come out of California. So California has these high fire threat districts. What these are is basically the California Public Utilities Commission, right, outlined criteria and objectives to create this high fire threat district map. It's available on the CPUC websites. And they've updated it with that. And what it's telling you really is tier 3 is areas of extreme risk and tier 2 is elevated risk. But it's one thing. This map is now a map that we've been using since 2017. 2019, it was updated a little bit more, but it could benefit, and I think the state could benefit for a more real-time map that constantly updates. And because of the various entities involved, for all public purposes, we all rely on, this is all three utilities in the California, as well as Cal Fire, as well as others, rely on this. And what you'll end up doing is you do independent modeling on your own, in your own silo, to figure out what's your situation. Now you reference this because you take different actions depending on the tier in an open, transparent way. That's the intent why we have this map this way. So what I'm proposing, if you go to the next slide, is we're seeing very clearly, right? We're seeing how the wildfire threat is spreading. I mean, it's been there in Australia for a long time. It's been in places like Portugal and Spain, and it's been in California. But it's spreading to Colorado. It's spreading up to Oregon. There are places of the globe that have not had to deal with this problem. Now, California, as painful as it is, we've dealt with it since 2017, and we're learning and getting better. But some sort of worldwide fire risk map would be extremely valuable to a lot of entities. Valuable from the perspective of they could start to say, what type of actions do we need to take at this location specifically? And so, given everything that I know, if I was a team on the outside, if I was a software development team, here's something that I think would be useful to the public. You can start with the fire scars, because there's a rich history of data. Just about every part of the globe has data about the fire scars. This is where fires have happened. And you can go back like 100 years. And you take that fire scar, because nature likes to have fire in generally the same locations. If you go look at the history of fire scars, even if you look at the history of ignitions, you should always ask a question: did that ignition take place in a fire scar? And so my learnings after being in this role for now 2.5 years, right, is if you can map those fire scars and overlay them, that alone will give you such a wealth of information. The second piece of it is, if an ignition occurs, there's the vegetation type and the density. And the type is pretty particular, because manzanita bushes and all that, they burn hot. There's types of vegetation, chaparral that burns at different intensities than others. There's different layers. We're seeing a common practice now on the fires in California that basically go to the tops of the trees. Once the fire has jumped to the tops of the trees, that's when the fire starts to exhibit its own behavior, because now you have a fire that even Cal Fire can't stop. And it's the ladder fuels effect that you see. So that's what I mean by vegetation type and density. And a lot of that, I used to work at Northrop Grumman. One of the things I like to say is I did work on that nice spacecraft that made its way to the Lagrange point, the James Webb Space Telescope. But there's so many instruments that are telling us about vegetation type and density. Are we putting it to full use? The last one is, and the middle block on vegetation type and density is what I call a mid-cycle. Fire scars, look back 100 years. Every year you'll have a new fire scar in a sense. Vegetation changes, but it changes over a 2-year, 3-year, 5-year period. So the time period is much less. And fuel moisture just depends on what has been the rainfall, what has been the groundwater, all of that. Fuel moisture is basically much more real time. It adjusts based on the drought, it adjusts based on the winds. So that's more real time. If some sort of layered map can be created with those simple layers, you now have a very powerful tool. And if you do it globally, it's of interest to people globally. So I'll stop there. I think I've gone right to 12:46, trying to keep this within half an hour and then leave plenty of time for questions. So this is my last slide. Happy to take questions. If you want to leave these slides up and we go with questions, or you just want to ask, and the questions don't need to be tied to just the content I provided. If there's any questions you guys have, happy to answer it in any way I can.
Andy, thank you very much for a compelling talk and giving us a little bit of information. And I'm excited, again, leading the hackathon effort, to see two really tangible problems that I think students can sink their teeth into this spring. And even if they're not here today, I'm probably going to make this recording available to them and share some of your insights with them. But I will open the floor to questions. As usual, we have 30 something people here, so feel free to just raise your hand, and I will call on you. If you're shy, which it's okay, you can type your question in the chat and I can speak it out. But I see Karen has her hand raised, so why don't you go, Karen?
Hi, I was wondering if PG&E has looked into spraying long-term fire retardant below like specifically like large transmission lines. So if something did happen, that at least the area below the lines wouldn't actually ignite.
Yeah, no, Karen, that's an excellent question. The answer to the question is no, and I'll tell you why. Last year, right, in light of the drought, I kicked off a program specifically, which we call Preventive Fire Retardant Program. And there's a couple things that one is we were using the same fire retardant that CAL FIRE uses to spray. But what has not been studied on the environmental conditions with spraying that fire retardant is the fact that the mass loading, if you put fire retardant in the same place multiple times, what is the effect on the ground and the ecology? That has not been studied. And so we're doing studies to figure that out. But the second thing is much more, which is it's basically putting chemicals on the ground. And even if those chemicals are used by CAL FIRE, there is a huge pushback from the community and that's why, right? What we did for last year, there are permits to put it on state lands, which are not authorized. You got to do the CEQA permitting. Where you can do it is on private land. And so last year we tried it on private land. We approached landowners and said, our lines are running through your line, not transmission lines, distribution lines. And we got an uptake rate of about 20%. Because we had to go ask them, is it okay for us to put it there? And 80% of them said no. And so that's part of the reason why we're not pursuing it this year, because it's extremely time intensive to get that done. And we don't understand the mass loading right now. I hope that answers your question.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Krishna, you're next.
Thanks, Andy. It was really nice for us to, like researchers, to get to talk to someone who's actually working on this. And excellent presentation as well. I have a question related to the points of failure in the infrastructure. You showed some images where there are trees above the tower and they may collapse on the tower and it might lead to a failure. So are towers the only point, or are the conductors also a point of failure? Where do the most failures occur? Can you give us a sense of that?
The most failures occur on the conductor because you know what, there's way more, it's kind of like oceans and land. There's way more ocean than there's land. There's way more conductor than there are structures. The structures you're talking about are really poles, distribution poles. The wooden poles that you'll see on the outside as you drive around, those are primarily distribution poles. And between one distribution pole and another distribution pole, there's generally about a quarter of a mile. And the conductor, there's three phases of conductor that's string. So relatively from an exposure perspective, it's the conductor that has more exposure.
And you talked about the distribution. So in the transmission network, is there failures as well?
Yes, transmission network also has failures. And frankly, if people ask, hey, but the Camp Fire, which is the biggest fire that, the most destructive one from a fatality perspective, right? The Camp Fire was transmission. But transmission fires, the transmission is really driven by degraded assets failing, right? Those wires are very high up. You don't get things falling into those wires, okay? So if you look at it from a distribution versus transmission, and it ties to Karen's point too, which is transmission, you only get like 1% of the ignitions come from transmission. Most of them come from distribution. So that's why the focus on distribution is way higher than on transmission. Okay. And folks, if you can ask all the questions, and if you don't have a question, just put it in the chat. I'll be happy to get back to you through Derek to answer your question.
That's really generous of you, Andy, and thanks for the question, Krishna. And I'm going to go to chat because Bill actually asked the question that I was going to ask you later on. You you mentioned, this whole tree inspection app, which I think is a great idea. Has there been any work done to see any utility in looking at a higher altitude, namely using drone technology? So you can imagine not only being able to cover ground that a human doesn't have to be there, but also you could see things from altitude.
Yeah. So
has there been any thought? Look, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know what we do. I shouldn't. We've used a lot of tools in the toolkit. Okay, so I think utilities are using it, right? I'll be honest with you. I think PG&E is pushing the envelope on this in a number of cases. What we have done is we do annually LiDAR aerial assessment. We basically fly aircraft. The reason we don't fly with drones is because of the restriction with beyond line of sight drones and working with the FAA. We've just got approval to do that for our inspections, but the LiDAR equipment tends to be a little bit heavier, so the drones and all of that is not, technically it's not dialed in. So when you fly aircraft, you collect the LiDAR data, you use the LiDAR data to assess if there's trees that are in dangerous conditions. But are there other sensors that we could put? Absolutely, we haven't gone down that path because just getting that data back calibrated in the right way is a challenge. The other piece of it is on the use of drones as well as the use of aircraft. The problem that you don't have is a lot of cases it's the ground under the tree, right? That's in the weak spot that'll cause the tree to fall. For the most part, the tree is falling because it's falling from the roots, unless it's codominant. And if those of you are not sure what codominant means, think of a tree is basically at some point in its trunk, it's basically split up. So it kind of goes up and it's two separate trees and it splits there and breaks. That's what a codominant tree is. So the reason for the ground check is because you catch a lot more hazard trees that way. You just catch a greater degree, and the aerial only catches it when you can look at the tips and all and you see it drying out. So that's what it catches well, the dried out aspect in the top reaches, which means that there's something in at the root that you got to check.
Fantastic. That makes me think, I don't want to get too down that road, but I wonder if other vehicles, maybe land-based vehicles, could expedite the process for imaging. So I won't ask that question right now, but that's something that comes to mind. Jill,
we want to hear if there's land-based things that we could do. Absolutely, and land-based would be so much nicer.
Jill, you have a question.
Hi. Yeah, Andy, thank you so much. This is a really, really interesting talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how PG&E thinks about like prioritization amongst all these different mitigation options, and if they're using like a cost effectiveness strategy, if there's like how you think about like monetized costs and some like non-monetized costs, or if it's a cost to the customer versus to the company or to society at large, how you're sort of like weighing all of those different things.
Yeah.
And you can say just like go look at the wildfire management plan if that's too big of a question.
No. It's something that's very near and dear to my heart, because what we've got to do is I just want to step back, because believe me, I can understand why people criticize PG&E, but it's like we got to provide safe, reliable, and affordable and green energy, right? We're trying to get all those. So the affordability is a big thing for us. I don't want anyone to like think we don't care about it. So whenever you're doing a mitigation, you're trying to evaluate on what you call a risk spend efficiency, an RSC calculation. And in its simplest form, it's you say, okay, if I do this, how much risk does it mitigate, right? So let me give you some numbers, and I just got to please, I don't expect these to be quoted, and if I get a data request, I'll never participate on a program like this. But let me explain to you what this the EVM program, right? To do the routine, that 12-foot clearance, and to do the conductor to sky, roughly, will cost us for about 2,000 miles. Will cost us about $150 million. Okay. Now when you do, if I put in enhanced power line safety settings, so that's only getting me 2,000 miles roughly. Okay. If I put in enhanced power line safety settings, I can put that in across my entire service territory, all 25,000 miles in high fire threat districts. And that'll cost me on an annual basis, because once I put it in there, I've got to actually, I've got to respond. So I can't just put it in there. When there's an outage, I have to respond and fix it. That cost me 170 million on an annual basis. We just finished these numbers, okay? So relatively speaking, here's now the expenditure. You got a sense they're about equivalent, let's put it that way, okay? But one thing covers 2,000 miles, the other thing covers 25,000 miles. So from an exposure perspective, I'm getting a much better pickup. And then the second piece of it is, how much risk mitigation am I seeing? Now, on a risk mitigation, for that overhang and that radial, if I use a scale of 1 to 100%, right? I get basically 15% of mitigation from the overhang and from the radial combined, because it's hard to say which one. We've done all this math based on ignitions, okay? So what you get, if you say you're getting 15% there, that's the maximum, because I've done that for a while. When I look at it from the perspective of EPSS, because we only did it last year for about 4 months, right? I only have 1 year's worth of data, and I want to be very conservative because I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. From a risk mitigation perspective, I get 30%. So right away, EPSS gets me a higher risk reduction. And then from an extent on where I can apply it basically over a much larger period for the same cost. So it's a no. From a risk spend efficiency, EPSS makes absolute sense. If you think about it just in terms of risk reduction points over 25,000 miles, you just assume 1 mile is equivalent everywhere, which we know is not entirely true, but you get 7,500 points of risk reduction that way, whereas on EVM, I'll only get roughly about 300 rough points, in the hundreds versus in the thousands. So that's and so we did, and we're making in our wildfire mitigation plan, since you referenced it, we're explaining, and I'm going to go to regulators and I'm going to go to others to explain why that I'm stopping a program, I'm stopping a strike potential where we would look and examine strike potential trees, and I'm stopping that because that only gives me a 7% risk reduction. And so I'm stopping that and I'm doing EPSS instead. So I hope I answered your question. So we look at all the programs with the risk spend efficiency. It's dependent on the programs, and I gave you the 2 that I covered here with the numbers. But
yeah, thank you.
Those numbers better not make their way into data requests or I'll be in hell.
I'm actually curious just if you could build on that. So these 2 examples I think were really helpful because there was that sort of clear like cost per mile and then a like spend per mile, or in the efficiency of risk reduction. But in cases where it's not so clear like who's paying for this cost or like what the sort of harm of either the cost or the risk is. So for example, like comparing the public safety power shutoffs to one of these other strategies, like is that also an easy calculation, or is that like a more complicated case of saying?
When you bring the aspect of reliability in here, right, which does need to be brought in, right? The reliability calculation is fairly challenging because you've got to say it has second or third order effects, right? If I turn off the power, then there's a business that obviously could not work that day, what got shut down. Whether it's, let's say it's a hairdressing salon, right? Hey, someone had planned to work that day, they were getting, all of a sudden there's a loss of income. How do you calculate that? Because electric service, powers so much of the economy that basically you shut down sections, it could cause billions of losses for people, but it's all distributed, so it's hard to say, right? So it's a really hard trade-off. And the hard trade-off is saying, okay, we're going to do this. We're realizing it's inconveniencing customers, but what I have to weigh is I'm doing it because a wildfire will inconvenience people a heck of a lot more. Evacuations, destroyed property is traumatic. So.
Thank you.
Great question and really nice answer. Thank you, Andy, for entertaining. I know some challenging questions.
No, it's a great question. Someone had wood management. I saw a little bit in the bottom, but I think I thought Kate was waiting for the question.
Yeah, I'm gonna let go, Kate, and then I'll go to Roger's question after that. And if more, we can fit them in.
Sure.
Great, thanks. Well, I was wondering if you could speak to any potential policy changes that might either facilitate the work that PG&E is already doing or allow PG&E to go in other fire mitigation or prevention efforts that they're not already pursuing. And I was thinking mostly on the state level, but I guess federal or local would be very interesting as well.
Well, this is, and now this is my own opinion, so please let me stay with that caveat. This is not PG&E's official policy, okay? I think a lot more can be done by looking really closely at the urban wildland interface and allowing developments to take place there, especially in light of where the fire maps that we now have. Because the housing situation in California, I happen to live in Walnut Creek, very nice location, that's all great. But you know what? If you can't afford that, you move further out. And when you move further out, you tend to move, unfortunately, into the wildland, urban wildland interface. And it's that interplay of housing cost where people are moving. So a policy change, I'm really very, very grateful for what Governor Newsom has done to allow those ADU units and things like that to start changing those rules. So that's one area at the state level. The other thing is with, I think a lot of people expect electric power. So now this is my selfish thing. A lot of people expect electric power to get delivered, right, regardless of where you live. But the expectation is actually they expect electric power to get delivered with wires. You can do a lot with remote grids. You can a lot. Right now, we still have to go and convince customers to put them on a remote grid. They'll still get electricity, but we've got to go convince them. And saying that if you're on a particular location, then the way you're going to get supplied is with a remote grid is something of a policy that could help in a big way. The third one is about the, you know what, if you see our poles, you have the poles up there, the wires, but you also have telecom on there. And what happens is in a wildfire, the poles could get weakened and they would fall right across the roadway, causing ingress, egress problems. That's, the campfire had a lot of that actually, ingress, egress. People couldn't get out, right, on Skyline Boulevard. When we underground 10,000 miles, which we are going to do, it'll happen. Unfortunately, in some places, those poles will still be up there because the telecom infrastructure is there. And there's no mandate to put that telecom infrastructure in the ground. So that's something else that the state could do at the policy level.
Awesome.
And to answer your question, honestly, all three of these, my boss right now is in the field with members of the governor's office, with the California Office of Energy Safety, Karen Jacob Thomas and others. And they're visiting sites just to look at these problems. So it's not as if it's not active. I've got to get the wildfire mitigation plan filed in February, so that's why I couldn't step out. Otherwise, I'd be in the field. We normally go out in the field at least once a month for 3 or 4 days out there just to see what the situations are like.
Thanks for the question, Kate, and thanks for the answer, Andy. So yeah, let's go to Roger's question in the chat. He said, "What is PG&E doing with the woody waste from the EVM projects?"
Yeah, so that's been contentious. The wood waste for the most part. First of all, you've got to understand the wood historically has been viewed as valuable, meaning like if I cut down the tree on your property, right, I don't have the right to just take that wood away because I could send it to a lumber mill or something. That's the presumption. The reality of it is, if you take that and the landowner wants it, then we leave the wood there. In the past, right, we were getting restrictions for even carrying the wood out of particular zones. And so for a while, PG&E went through this situation where we cut the lumber, but we didn't carry it. We left it where it stood to degrade. Since that time, we've changed our policy to say, listen, if we're going to cut the tree, right, we request with the landowner, what do we want to do about that? What do they want to do with the tree? Do they want it as firewood? Do they want to keep it? What do they want to do with it? If they don't want it, then we attempt to dispose of it. It means you can shred it right there, or you could basically have it shipped up. We're trying to work with contractors in multiple places to have that shipped to lumber mills for the useful lumber, but not for all of it, because some wood is just the tree's scarred. It's not appropriate. But it's been a tricky subject. Okay, so again, like the last topic, it's a tricky subject. Santa Cruz had filed, the Santa Board of Supervisors filed issues with us last year. We worked with Napa. I personally went up there with the chief risk officer, and we made a determination on the wood management, is what we call it, to basically address that right away.
Well,
I hope that answered your question. Sorry?
Oh, I was going to say a lot of tricky questions. Did that answer your question, Kate?
Did I answer your question? Or do you have lumber on your land somewhere?
Oh, no, actually, it was Roger's question. Sorry. Yes, he said
Roger.
thanks. So I think he did.
Okay.
Alex, you're next.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I just want to come back and also echo comments from Krishna and others. This was a really fantastic piece of insight that we've been getting so far. I just had a question about how you think about risk kind of separate from some of these trade-offs you were talking about before. So it seems like you're talking about risk mostly as risk of a fire occurring when you talk about risk of fire. When you're kind of weighing maybe multiple areas with similar risk and risk safety efficiencies, or what the phrase was, do you think much about, or what do you think about beyond just sort of the yes, no, does a fire occur? Do you think about where fires might grow the largest as affecting your risk in a significant way? Do you think about how many customers are affected
Yeah, let me answer your question. We do, even for all, so there's that bow tie analysis that you do, right?
Uh-huh.
The bow tie analysis starts, which given what you're saying, I'm pretty sure you sound like you've seen it of somewhere, but it starts with what is the ignition event? What could cause an ignition? So that's the left of the bow tie, right? Things that could cause an ignition. And then the right of the bow tie is from that ignition, what is the consequence of that ignition? So it's really the left is cause and consequence. Think of it that way. So on the consequence side, there's a lot of things that you weigh in, right? You can weigh in from a consequence at that particular location. Has fires grown? Also in that location, if you look around it, what is the risk to life first, then property second, and then acreage burn third, right? You do it very consciously in that area to make sure that you basically protect. So if I choose a point anywhere on my service territory, right? My question, and we do this, we basically simulated, we drop an ignition point, right? And we simulate with weather conditions. There's a company called TechnoSilver that we use. It simulates that with literally a few million simulations, like what will happen and what will be the extent of this fire over an 8-hour period. And at every hour, where is it going? Now, since it's a particular location in space and time, you can also say, what is the population density? What is the structure density around that? And from that, you get a consequence score. So that's the consequence score for every single 100 meter by 100 meter square around our lines. There's a consequence score. Now you'll refresh that every year, but that's the consequence side from that. The risk side depends on, was the risk caused by vegetation falling into the line? Because then you have a whole, a machine learning model to try and predict that. Or was it due to an equipment failure that happened? Or was it due to an animal that ran on the line? You're trying to find that spot on 25,000 miles where it had that situation. And the combination of the event times the consequence gives us our risk score. And we try to prioritize the work based on the risk score.
Great, thanks. That was very informative.
All right, we probably have time at least for one more. In the chat session, Dee writes, PG&E has traditionally funded popular chipping programs in the UWI. This year, they ended that support in my county, which is Santa Clara. Is this seen as not an effective way to reduce risk or other reason for ending the support?
Yeah, can you repeat that? I didn't catch the program.
So the program was a chipping program. I assume a wood chipping program.
Yeah.
And it's okay if you're not, yeah, I mean, if you're not aware of the program, but yeah, she's saying that there was that PG&E had traditionally been funding a wood chipping program.
And
it's ended.
Just for clarity, it was operated by the Santa Clara County Fire Safe Council, and other Fire Safe Council does this in other counties as well. And we usually get a generous donation from PG&E to operate that program, but they ended it. And I heard through the grapevine that perhaps they thought it was not an efficient way to reduce risk. It's popular, so we're having to deal with the fallout of the neighbors who are used to having us come by with chipper, and we just chip it back onto their property, but it gets them to do their work, their own work, in the WUI areas. So I was just
Yeah,
curious.
no. So
reasoning.
the reason I'm not as familiar with it is we still fund fire safe councils, right? So I think we still give money to fire safe. I don't have the exact numbers on top of my head. The statement that we don't view it as risk, honestly, anything that will take out vegetation around property will take out some risk. The question is how much, and it depends on the location, right? But the fire safe councils are very effective mechanisms to help, work in partnership with the community. And I don't think our funding for the fire safe councils has gone down. I don't know that top of my head, but I don't think it has gone down.
Yeah, it's been eliminated for Santa Clara County.
For Santa Clara County specifically, okay. I'll have to go look and ask why. I don't know that answer then. Why? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I will actually ask one more question that follows up the previous, because Leong's asking about, in your model of risk, do you consider the likelihood of the events themselves?
Yeah, that's what I said. The ignition event is the likelihood of an ignition event times the consequence of an ignition event. That's really the left of the bow tie is likelihood.
Got it.
I was trying not to use like words that, I was trying to use just as simple language as possible. Sorry.
No, I appreciate that. Well, I think we're about at the ending time. You heard Andy generously offer, if you have follow-up questions, you can pipe them through me and I will email them to him. I hope most of you agreed that Andy was an awesome speaker and very good at entertaining a variety of questions. And at least for me, I now have a lot more insights into the nuances of the so many problems that Andy and his team at PG&E has to have to contend with. So I know sometimes PG&E is probably the scapegoat or have the ire of the public, but I really appreciate the work that Andy and his team are doing. And then Andy, thank you again for taking the time to speak with us and share your insights and be so good at entertaining questions.
Yeah. Hey, Darren, I just want to end and say, hey, I appreciate the opportunity to come here. Appreciate everyone's interest in this area. As you know, since I'm doing this as my job, that these questions are really useful because it kind of gets me a sense of what people are thinking. And honestly, I'm on LinkedIn. Just message me and ask a question, and I'll answer your question as best I can. Depending if it's something super sensitive to the company, I'll be honest with you and said, hey, this is confidential. I can't answer it. But otherwise, you'll be surprised how many questions I get and have more than especially if people are in California. I do care that we give the Californians answers, especially in our service territory. So with that, thank you, Derek.
Well, you're very welcome. And thanks again for that generous offer. Thank you for everyone attending, and we'll see you next week on Zoom for another great talk about wildland fires. Have a great afternoon and see you next week.